Of course, Robert E. Lee, he graduated from West Point in 1829, second in his class. He was commissioned in the Corps of Engineers and had a very distinguished career. First as an engineer, later transferred to cavalry. Of course, his best-known performances were his roles on Winfield Scott's staff during the Mexican War, where Lee's performance so impressed Scott that Scott said afterwards that if the United States government took out an insurance policy on Robert E. Lee worth $5 million, it would be a bargain for the United States government. It was worth that much to the country. Now, Robert E. Lee also has the honor, as Brian knows, of being a member of the Fort Leavenworth Hall of Fame, and which is odd because he was never really stationed there very long. The only time he was there was for a court-martial. But Fort Leavenworth will sometimes try to get all the glory, reflected glory from people that can. But Lee was not there. Lee may not have been there because Kansas has some particular issues dating back to our territorial days. But Kansas has been successful in its mission of keeping America safe from Missouri since 1854. So Lee had some time in Kansas, but not enough to help this guy out. Although these two have a connection later on at Harper's Ferry. So see how it all connects somehow? It's like a big 6 degrees of that Kevin Bacon thing going on. All right. Discussing the Civil War. Study of the Civil War, the focus, battles, leaders, approaching the Civil War as a conventional conflict between two nation states like World War II and the Napoleonic Wars. What I do like to get people thinking about is the Civil War as part of a larger sectional conflict, just the most intense phase of the sectional conflict. And it's a sectional conflict that the intensity rises and falls over past 200 or so years. And during the Civil War, the basic issue was the Confederacy said they're an independent country and were waging an interstate war, the war between the states. But the Lincoln administration couldn't accept that because it did not concede the legitimacy of secession. And so, think about the war. It is much like the American Revolution. It is I use the term insurgency to define the Confederacy as an effort to try to overthrow the established government and secure the loyalty of the Southern people to a new political arrangement. And consequently, the war, while it is a conventional war between two armies in which they are fighting for critical pieces of terrain, critical points on the battlefield, critical points of lines of communication, always must be kept in mind that what's important on the battlefield is significant how it plays into a larger conflict for the hearts and minds of the people of the South. What John Shai in his essay on the American Revolution talks about the triangularity of the struggle. The two armies are contending against each other, and battlefield events are significant for how they affect the larger core issue of the war, which is the loyalty of the Southern people. The North's effort to try to find the combination of carrots and sticks that will lead people of the South to come back to loyalty to the Union. The military events are important for how they relate to this. Okay, so that's a relatively clear explanation of sort of the way I'm approaching the problem. All right, Confederate strategy. When we study warfare, teaching the professional military, we teach them to think about warfare on three levels of war. The first, most important, is the strategic level of war. Basic argument is you can get tactics right, you can get operations right, but if you get strategy bad, it's almost irrelevant. The greatest example of this is the Germans in the 20th century who are, get on History Channel because they win a lot of battles. Well, at least when the History Channel was doing history. Because they have the cool helmets, they won the battles and all that stuff. But what's the record of the German military? What's the record of Germany in wars in the 20th century?
0-2.
0-2, right? 0-2. And there's a famous story of there was a soccer match between the British and the French, and of course, soccer, we call soccer, they call football, is the national game in Britain. And in the game, the German national team was leading the British national team at halftime. And it was it was like one of those insurmountable soccer leagues, like 2-0, okay? And so the coach came in, talked to his players, and he said to his players famously, today the Germans may beat us at our national game, but we can take comfort that twice in a century we beat them twice at theirs. So the strategic level of war is a level of war at which nations establish their war aims, what they're trying to achieve, the ends of their objectives, and they try to figure out ways to manage the means at their disposal to achieve those ends. Okay, so that's strategic level of war. So the policy of war. What are we trying to achieve in this war? Lowest level of war is the tactical level of war, in which armies engage with each other and fight with each other. Sort of the Battle of Gettysburg, Battle of Antietam, which you all recently studied. This is the tactical level of war. Think of what Edwin Sumner did in the East Woods, in the West Woods. Or a book on Antietam, for God's sake. What happened to him he started in the East Woods, he ended up in the West Woods, and it didn't work out very well. But what Sumner did in the West Woods, that's tactical, how you manage a particular battle. Connecting the strategy of war with the actual engagements is what's called the operational level of war. And that's where campaigns are planned to try to connect battlefield events with the larger strategic goals. Okay? Antietam is significant. It connects to large strategic goals because by thwarting the Confederate invasion of Maryland, it maintains northern morale, depresses southern morale, and it provides Lincoln the opportunity to adjust the ends of the war to include emancipation. Okay, so think of strategically. What is the objective of the Confederacy? Jefferson Davis's strategy would describe it as an offensive defense. That's when they're going to develop. Initially, due to limits of resources, the Confederacy decides at the beginning of the war to adopt a defensive strategy. Their objectives are simply to maintain the loyalty of the Southern people to the Confederacy. And the way to do that is to defend it, because the first responsibility of any government is to protect its people. If a government can't protect its people, nobody's going to consent to be governed by a government that can't protect them. I mean, that's one of the first rules of government. Okay? So their first responsibility is to protect the Southern people, to demonstrate that they can protect the Confederacy from the contamination of Yankeeism. Okay? The South secedes, Southern leaders secede from the Union on the grounds that their rights will not be safe under a United States government run by Republicans. Okay? That's the basic idea. And you need an independent Confederacy to protect Southern rights, and therefore, if the South can't protect Southern rights, that delegitimizes them in the eyes of the people of the South. So the objective is naturally it's a defensive one. We want to protect our property, defend our terrain, and prove to the Southern people that we can protect them, and therefore they should consent to be governed by us. The operational approach initially is a defensive one. Okay? The basic idea is we'll stand on the defensive, wait for the Yankees to come in, just like they did at First Manassas, just as they did at Wilson's Creek. They'll take the offensive, we'll defeat them in a battle, but leave the initiative, leave the offensive to the Yankees, because they're the ones who need to change things, not us. Status quo stays the same, we're fine, but it's up to the North to take the initiative. Now, there's a problem with this, and that is giving the initiative to the Federals proves to be a significant problem. It is not necessary to post a Confederate soldier on every mile of the southern border with the North. Because of logistical considerations, armies, as you studied in the Civil War, armies of invasion, if they're going to operate, they need logistical support. They can't really live off the land very effectively, and the North really doesn't have the incentive early in the war to live off the land because they're trying to send assurance to the Southerners that your property is safe under the federal government. The federal government starts living off the land, that sends a message to Southerners, your property is not safe under a Yankee government, and that encourages them to support the Confederacy. But for logistical considerations, armies need one of two things to sustain themselves in the field if they're going to be conducting major operations with significant armies larger than 30,000 men. And they need either railroad or they need a river. Now, that sort of somewhat simplifies the situation of the Confederacy because they don't need to post a man at every mile of the border. They just need to concentrate armies everywhere that the Yankees can come in. They find the rivers, find the railroads, and try to block those up. Now, the problem with being on the defensive is it gives the initiative to the Federals. It gives the Federals the ability to pick and choose where they can conduct their offensive operations. And this proves in early 1862 to be a very bad thing for the Confederacy. Because invariably in 1862, when Northerners are given the choice about the Southern defensive, they choose to use rivers. Railroads are generally are a necessary evil sometimes, because railroads create a dynamic that we call strategic exhaustion, which is, as an invading army advances, it has to leave behind defenses for its line of communications. Okay? Rivers are relatively secure. Railroads are hard to protect because, how many people does it take to mess up a railroad? One person, provided he's equipped with a match or something like that, right? So consequently, if a Union army is advancing along a railroad, it's going to have to leave guys behind, and there's going to be a point at which they're leaving so many guys behind to protect their line of communications that at the point of the spear, where they're actually going to fight, they are so diminished in manpower there's going to be even fight. So for the Confederacy, it's better if the Union is advancing along railroads. Also, because railroads are so vulnerable, Union Army is going to be very, very vulnerable if they're in a war of maneuver, because railroads are very vulnerable to those. Rivers have less of a problem, in large part because the Union has pretty much a monopoly on naval power. They provide secure logistics, and in Virginia in particular, the James River takes you right up to the doorstep of Richmond. And you're going to have the situation in 62. This defensive operational approach is going to cede to the North the initiative, and the North is going to achieve a series of tactical and operational victories. Out west, using the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers, Ulysses S. Grant, apparently Bob's hero, right? Since you're doing a book on Gouverneur Warren, I'm sure the Grant fans will love you. Okay, but out there, Grant achieved success operating what we call joint operations along the rivers with secure logistics. The Confederates can try to block up the rivers using land defenses, but the problem now for the Confederacy is when you've got land defenses, it's a contest of engineering, and the North has far superior engineers to the Confederacy, which is why they try to stop them at Fort Henry, they try to stop them at Fort Donelson, but it ultimately proves to be futile. On the Mississippi River, the North is able to achieve successes there under the command of John Hope, which is another one of Bob's heroes. And most significantly, in Virginia, what's going to happen is the problems with this initial Confederate strategy are going to be illustrated by what happens in 1862 in the Peninsula Campaign. Now, one of the things we do with the military officers is I teach them in the Department of Military History. And the idea is to help them use history to guide their thinking, their professional judgment, to inform them. And history had that same function for people in the Civil War. I mean, we are products of past experience, correct? And the reason you study history is to benefit from the past experience of others. You study your own history for lessons for how to do things in the future. Now, sometimes history is properly studied, sometimes it is. And so one of the things is how Robert E. Lee uses the early history of the war to shape the strategy that is going to lead to the Battle of Gettysburg. Again, use of history is often used by policymakers. I mentioned last night, why did we fight in Korea? The answer is often, we fought in Korea, the slogan was to save Prague, Czechoslovakia. But what that meant was, in 1938, the Allies had the opportunity to stop a totalitarian dictator, right? But instead, they turned over the Sudetenland to Hitler, and they thought this would prevent the next war, and all that happened was, you got a lot worse war. So the lesson of 1938 was, you have to stand up to dictators immediately, the lesson of Munich. And in 1950, when the North Koreans, their totalitarian state, attacks, Harry Truman draws on that lessons of history. And so sometimes it's often said, we fought in Korea to save Prague, to show we had learned the lessons of that history. And there's this humorous episode of The Simpsons where, but this guy sees his wife meets his wife, and his wife was in the military, and he says, honey, I thought you was in Iraq stopping 9/11. Okay? Now, on the one hand, that's meant to be funny, But why do we go into Iraq? One of the reasons is to prevent future 9/11s. If we don't get involved in the Middle East in some ways, informing it, changing it, you relieve 9/11. I mean, that's one of the arguments. You don't have to all agree with it, but those are the arguments, using the lessons of history. Okay? And consequently, one of the ways I answer the question, why is Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg? What is shaping his thinking at Gettysburg? And my answer is going to be, Lee is fighting at Gettysburg to save Yorktown. Okay? Now, Yorktown campaign. The one we all know about, right, is the one that George Washington wins single-handedly for, because we can't give any credit to the French, right? Rochambeau, right? Okay. It doesn't matter. It's all their engineering, all their engineers. But then in 1862, as you all know, there is a second Yorktown campaign, a second siege of Yorktown that takes place. Now, most of the focus when in literature on the campaign in Yorktown is placing in the context of this conflict in the Union High Command between McClellan, who Lincoln is constantly giving this to, and McClellan, who is constantly pushing back. McClellan wants to conduct siege operations. Lincoln says, break the enemy's lines. McClellan says, I was tempted to tell him to break the lines himself. But the focus is often on that side of the campaign. And in this leads to, McClellan versus Lincoln. McClellan can't win this contest. But in analyzing the Yorktown campaign and its longer range effect on the war, look at what's happening on the Confederate side as McClellan is digging his trenches and bringing up his artillery for the Yorktown campaign. At the beginning of the campaign, as McClellan's forces are landing the peninsula, moving towards Yorktown, Joseph Johnston, the first commander of the Department of Northern Virginia, later Army Northern Virginia, writes when he finds out that he's ordered to go down the peninsula, his response is up there on the slide. We can have no success while McClellan is allowed to conduct warfare along his lines. Again, I don't have the slide in front of me, but you can see it up there, right? We cannot succeed. We are engaged in a species of war that we cannot win. Now, the worst kind of condition you can be in warfare is to have no good way of winning. And the Confederacy looks at what McClellan is doing at Yorktown. By being slow, by being methodical, by digging trenches, McClellan has put the Confederate Army in a no-win situation. It can't attack McClellan's army because it's too strong in its fortifications and artillery. It can't stay at Yorktown because once McClellan opens up with his artillery and engineers, the army that's in Yorktown will be trapped and captured. And it can't evacuate Yorktown right away because to do so would be to concede impotence in the face of Northern military strength. And a confession of impotence in the face of Northern military strength, coming after all of this string of Union victories, Fort Donelson, Mill Springs, etc., would undermine the ability of the Confederacy to say to the people of the South, you should support us, you should consent to be governed by us because we can protect you. And against that's McClellan's sort of strategy. We want to create the impression of overwhelming power, of overwhelming strength, to discredit the Southern leadership's promise of protecting the people of the South, and by not attacking slavery, we will make it unnecessary for them to resist because we'll give them assurances that if they quit and stop consenting to the Confederacy, everything will be fine for them. But the situation is a bad one for the Confederates. They're in a situation, they're situation with no good options. They can't retreat immediately because then that gives, again, that leaves the impression of impotence, and they give up Norfolk and all kinds of other consequences as well. Ultimately, Johnston is forced to retreat. He pulls out of Yorktown just before McClellan begins opening his artillery, because he knows that once McClellan does that, he not only loses Yorktown, but loses his army. Johnston retreats back towards Richmond and faces the same basic situation. McClellan's going to conduct operations methodically, carefully, cautiously, and in types of operations in which the North has an asymmetric advantage. We often use this term talking about militaries with our officers. The concept of asymmetric advantage. What gives your force an asymmetric advantage over the enemy? When two armies have symmetry, that means they're basically equipped the same way, have the same technology, have the same techniques. World War I is sort of viewed as the great illustration of armies that are in symmetry with each other, because they really cannot achieve anything with each other. A generation later, 1940, we see Germany with their concept where they come to this blitzkrieg, having an asymmetric advantage over the Confederates. So asymmetry is a search for ways to have an advantage over the enemy. McClellan views his forces have an asymmetrical advantage in 3 areas. One is naval power. Okay. Now, this is neutralized a bit by the CSS Virginia, but of course there's a problem here in the peninsula because once the Confederacy has to give up Yorktown, they're going to have to give up Norfolk. When they give Norfolk, they give up the CSS Virginia as well. One is in naval resources. The other 2 asymmetric advantages the Federals have are in engineering and in artillery because of the nature of the antebellum army and the commissioning process, the education process at West Point that all the commanding generals in the Civil War went through. Now, at West Point, the curriculum at the United States Military Academy is overwhelmingly focused on technical aspects of war. Above all, engineering and artillery. If you do well at West Point, the most prestigious branches in the Army are engineering and artillery. The legacy of Sylvanus Thayer, Dennis Hart Mahan. I mean, if you gradually do well at West Point, you go in the engineers as a sign that this is a good guy, this is a future leader in the Army. Of course, number 2 in the class of 1829, Robert E. Lee becomes a member of the Corps of Engineers. Number 2 in 1846, George McClellan becomes an engineer. And one cadet will later write in his memoirs, we were taught that the engineers were sort of the gods of the military. And that's because of the nature of the way the military system develops early on. Engineering and artillery are not the kind of things that can be improvised using citizen soldiers. Infantry leadership somewhat can be. You can have Andrew Jackson bring him off the street and he can point a sword and the guys can go, yeah, we'll go attack. But to build trenches, to have artillery, that takes technical skill. And I'll bring this back to the American Revolutionary experience. When we fought the American Revolution, we had a serious problem. And that was the most important point on our map, according to George Washington, was where the Hudson River made a bend around a West Point. Okay? Problem was, when the Continental Congress said, is there any engineer who can build some trenches there, who can build some fortifications there? There are no American trained engineers. What finally happens is a Dutch botanist steps forward and says, I've read a book on engineering. And they said, we'll hire him. He doesn't do a very good job of building fortifications around West Point. And ultimately, we've got to hire a Polish engineer to build our fortifications around West Point. After the war, there's a thinking, you know what? It may not be a good idea to rely on foreign armies for our technical skill. So during the Washington administration, a School of Application of Engineers is established. In 1802, that becomes the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. But the technical orientation means that products of a commercial, technical, capitalistic society are going to do better at West Point. Which of the 2 sections of the country is more oriented towards commerce, improvement, and technical projects? It's going to be the North, okay? So cadets from the North tended to do better at West Point, which means when they got commissioned, they went into the Corps of Engineers or the artillery. Now, Southern cadets tended to do not so well at West Point, so they ended up commissioned in cavalry or the infantry. And as I mentioned last night, see why you want to be an engineer. In your military career, you'll get to build forts along the East Coast. You'll get to mingle with society. And but if you're a cavalryman, you get stuck out west chasing Indians around. And godforsaken places like Fort Leavenworth. Williams becomes to Sherman, stuck to Staff College there for a reason. That's where we're isolated from the politicians and the civilian influences of the East. It's still a nice place. You should still visit it. Okay. It's improved since 1835. Okay. You're running water now. All right. But so you have the North has an asymmetric advantage in engineering and artillery. And if you are in a situation where your armies are in a set piece situation, where it comes down to who can identify the best terrain, who can hold the best terrain, can build the best trenches, can manage their artillery and their big guns better, if there's a campaign and operation like that, the North is going to have an asymmetric advantage. Okay? And this is illustrated at Yorktown. It's a slow campaign, it's a methodical campaign, it's a digging campaign, but ultimately for the North, it is an irresistible campaign that the South has no way of resisting. And McClellan, when Lee replaces Johnson in command, he recognizes that McClellan wants to do the exact same thing in front of Richmond, make it a campaign of trenches and of artillery. And as Lee says, we cannot get at them without attacking, which would be very hazardous to our forces. So this is going to be a catalyst for a fun thing. At Lee's problem here. How do you know McClellan's strategy and operational approach was effective? Because the Confederates fundamentally reorient their strategy because they realize that they cannot succeed on the terms that McClellan is trying to impose on the war. They fundamentally changed their strategy. Still a defensive strategy overall. Okay, they want to preserve their independence, although there is some, try to redeem Maryland and those things. But for the most part, it's a strategic defensive. What they do is they shift to an operational offensive. And instead of trying to be strong everywhere, defend everywhere the Yankees can come in, and surrendering the initiative to the Federals, the new idea is to concentrate your forces so you can pick and choose the places where the campaigns will take place. You're going to look for places where you can have campaigns of maneuver rather than campaigns that are set piece, involving trenches, and heavy artillery. And Lee recognizes if McClellan has an asymmetric advantage in artillery and engineering, Lee will have an asymmetric advantage in infantry and cavalry. Again, Southerners did not do so well at West Point, and consequently, they're going to be overrepresented in the cavalry branch in the Army before the war. So there is going to be a qualitative advantage that the South is going to have in cavalry, which is important because in McClellan's vision of warfare, you know where the enemy is, and because you're digging right in front of him. Okay, in a maneuver situation, you're in a fluid situation where you're not really certain where the enemy is, so that's where cavalry is very important for gathering intelligence. Okay, also Lee recognized with a good judo, you turn the enemy's strengths against them. An army that's big in engineering and artillery is also going to have a very, very big logistics. It's going to be very, very sensitive to its logistics, okay? Especially if it's bigger. Moreover, a larger army is going to react to situations slower, march slower. At the end of 62, Lincoln is going to ask a question. He's going to say, why can't we march like the enemy does, fight like the enemy does, live like the enemy does? And the answer is because your army is different. Your societies produce two different types of armies. The Union Army is very good. They're a big heavyweight, okay? They're very good in a slugging match. The Confederate Army is a lighter guy, faster and quicker. The important thing the little guy needs to do is avoid getting stuck in one place, okay? And that's sort of the situation at Yorktown. And the situation Lee recognizes McClellan wants to replicate in front of Richmond. And if we Southerners stay on the defensive, we are going to lose Richmond the way we lost Yorktown. And if we lose Richmond after losing Yorktown, the tide of Union victory may overwhelm Southern ability to support our cause. So what Lee is going to do is emphasize the operational offensive. It's going to have several effects. First, it is going to save Richmond. Now, one of the keys to the success of Lee's efforts is that the Yankees are going to give him a lot of help. Okay? McClellan's advance on Richmond is going to be tied to a railroad instead of the rivers. It is tied to the railroads because Lincoln has decided to hold back forces from McClellan's army to protect Washington. And then Lincoln releases them to march south from Fredericksburg in order to protect Washington. And he tells McClellan, since this force is coming down from the south, you can't be on the James River. You must base your operations. You must use the York River Railroad as your line of supply. What Lee does in the 7 days battles is, well, first the Shenandoah Valley campaign, which prevents the forces coming down from the north. And then what Lee does, because McClellan is dependent on the supply line, Lee has an opportunity to maneuver against it. And in the 7 days battles, he goes after McClellan's supply line. And by targeting and rendering that supply line untenable, which McClellan can't do without, the objective is to force McClellan to get out of his trenches, and so they can fight in the open ground in a fluid situation where Lee's lighter, faster army, and hopefully more knowledgeable army, will have an advantage. Okay? You get the 7 days battles happening where Lee achieves his operational objective of getting the Federals to fall back from the front of Richmond. It ends up in some ways not good for Lee because McClellan ends up on a river, and there are a series of engagements that make clear that a set-piece engagement is not good for Lee, the last of which being Malvern Hill, where McClellan's armies blast Lee's army pretty good. But the effect is it's a success. Richmond is saved. It is further saved when Abraham Lincoln tells McClellan, leave the peninsula, come up north, and operate and send your forces to John Pope's army, who is going to operate along a railroad. This campaign sets almost a perfect situation for Robert E. Lee, because with John Pope's forces tied to the railroad, Lee's army, more maneuverable army, is going to be in a situation where it can be more effective. It maneuvers against Pope's supply line, gets Pope in an uncertain situation where the information is unclear, there's contradictory information, he can't pin the Confederates down. When he pins the Confederates down, the situation is still kind of fluid, he's uncertain, he makes mistakes, and then Lee is able to capitalize at Second Manassas. So once again, Robert E. Lee has gotten an assist from the Union High Command. Lee then goes into Maryland, and then McClellan is placed in command, who conducts the campaign the way Robert E. Lee does not need it conducted. Slow, methodical, once again frustrating to Lincoln, but McClellan very carefully manages his army. The objective is not to make any mistakes that will give the Confederates an opportunity, and eventually Lee's army is forced to return back to Virginia. But again, Lincoln fires him, and the command goes to Burnside. They then move down to Fredericksburg. They fight the battle down there, where once again, needless to say, Robert E. Lee gets a lot of assistance from the Federals. The Battle of Fredericksburg, you all know about that, right? Okay. Ambrose Burnside's a very helpful guy. Although it's always fun to point out to the Longstreet people that he did lose to Ambrose Burnside. Thank you. All right. We just heard about Fredericksburg, right? You know about great Confederate victory. You just sit there, the Yankees come to the Confederates, and they lose the battle. Robert E. Lee, are you happy? In truth, after the battle, Lee is going to have a conversation with one of his subordinates. And he's going to say, after Fredericksburg, our people were very happy, we won a victory. I was very depressed. How can you be depressed after Fredericksburg? The enemy basically 2-to-1 casualties. Lee's response is, we won the battle, but we weren't able to do anything with it. The Federals just pulled back across the river, and we could do nothing more with it. Begin the 1863 campaign. Lee's objective in 1863 is not to sit there behind the Rappahannock River and wait for the Federals to attack. What Lee wants to do in 1863 is he wants to go north again. The problem is James Longstreet's command is sent down to southeastern Virginia, and so Lee is forced on the defensive, not by his own choice in the Chancellorsville campaign, but by this use of Longstreet's command. Initially, the campaign at Chancellorsville doesn't start out very well for Lee, because Hooker is able to take the first move to Chancellorsville, and then Hooker begins putting his forces in a. Hooker came to command promising to de-McClellanize the army. But at Chancellorsville, if you look at Hooker's conduct of the campaign, his objective is to get the Confederates into a set-piece engagement at some point, and so he can blast them to pieces. That's why Lee must either ingloriously fly, which would be great, because he'd retreat, but almost what Hooker really wants is to reverse Fredericksburg on him. Or he must give us battle in our chosen position. And that's Hooker's objective. Problem is, of course, the 11th Corps is out there, doesn't make any preparations, and consequently Jackson is able to carry out his famous flank march to Chancellorsville and roll up the 11th Corps and achieve a tactical success. And of course, that's where the focus of the Chancellorsville campaign goes, on that wonderful Jackson maneuver. And the reason Jackson is able to pull this off is because the situation in Chancellorsville still has a bit of fluidity. The following day, the situation around Chancellorsville is not so fluid. And Lee is going to conduct brutal frontal assaults against the Federal position. They're going to drive the Federals from Chancellorsville, but they're going to pay a huge butcher's bill for it. And eventually Hooker's guys are forced to fall back across across the Rappahannock. Lee later says, our people were ecstatic after Chancellorsville. Lee's greatest victory. Lee says, I was more depressed after Chancellorsville than I was after Fredericksburg. We had suffered horrendous casualties, and we could not exploit our victory. Now, he faces another problem after Chancellorsville, which is there was discussion in the Confederate High Command, the political leadership, of sending part of his army out west. Lee opposes this because once Longstreet's command arrives, Lee wants to make the offensive movement into Pennsylvania to try to get the Federals away from. Lee recognizes perhaps we can keep winning these kind of defensive battles on the Rappahannock. We can keep fighting these battles. But every day that goes, these battles are not good for us. Indeed, Lincoln in some ways reads the situation the same way. After Fredericksburg, 2-to-1 casualties. Lincoln has a conversation with some people in Washington, and after he reflects on, looks at the casualty numbers and goes, you know what, this is bad, but it's not really that bad for us, because we lose 2-to-1 casualties. If we fight the Battle of Fredericksburg every day for the next week, we'll still have some guys left, and they won't. And Lincoln said, if we can find a general who can realize this awful arithmetic, then we'll win the war. So consequently, Lincoln understands this, and Lee recognizes they can keep fighting these battles across the Rappahannock, along the Rappahannock. You can keep winning these Chancellorsvilles, but the Vietnam War, famously, you win the battles, but you lose the war. There's a famous conversation that happened in 1975, 73 at the Paris, between an American colonel and a North Vietnamese colonel. In this famous conversation, the American colonel said to the North Vietnamese colonel, you never defeated us on the battlefield. And the North Vietnamese colonel famously said, that may be true, but it is irrelevant. And this is the linking of tactical events, operational conduct, strategic events. Battles are not fought for the sake of battles. Terrain is important, but the question, cost-benefit. The terrain Lee won back at Chancellorsville was not worth to the Confederacy the casualties and the long-term consequences that had for the Confederacy. Okay? Yeah, Hooker gave up some ground, but if they could fight Fredericksburg every week, they can sure fight at Chancellorsville every day for a week. And so Lee, due to the same dynamics that had terrified the Confederate High Command at Yorktown. At some point, you just can't fight the kind of campaign there in a way that will achieve significant Confederate success. And so, Lee decides to move north and begins pushing north out in the Shenandoah Valley. See how am I doing on time? I'm getting short on time. Battle of Gettysburg. It's a 3-day battle. Okay. Campaign. Lee moves north into the Shenandoah Valley and up and crosses the Potomac, the Cumberland Valley. Joe Hooker is in command. Okay. Hooker manages command very carefully, very methodically, moving toward the north to confront Lee. Okay. Of course, the situation for Lee becomes problematic because the cavalry doesn't serve him very well when he's north of the Potomac, which is, you did the Antietam campaign, Maryland campaign tours. I'm sure Jeb Stuart's problematic performance in the Maryland campaign come up at some point. He's not very good north of the Potomac River. Okay. It's like there's a spell that's cast on him. So Lee doesn't have the same kind of intelligence advantage he would have had in Virginia, but he's got a clear vision for how he wants the campaign to develop. His basic idea is he's hoping that the Lincoln administration will, through exerting pressure on Hooker, lead Hooker to make decisions that give Lee the opportunity to fight Hooker's army, not when it's all concentrated, not when it's a single position, not when it's engineering and artillery can play a role. What Lee is hoping is that pressure from Washington will induce Hooker to conduct his operations in a way that create opportunities for Lee to get a campaign and maneuver, to fight one part of Hooker's army, fight another part of Hooker's army, defeat them, and eventually create a cascading effect that will defeat the Federal Army. And of course, on the first day of Gettysburg, how does the day go? Pretty good for Robert E. Lee, because what kind of battle, what kind of engagement is it? Is this an engineering battle? Is this an artillery battle? It's an infantry battle, right? It's a faster battle. So which army can concentrate faster in the battle and get a little bit of help, a little bit of luck, right? Napoleon. What kind of qualities do you look for in a general, Napoleon? It says, give me luck, right? Give me generals got luck. Pretty much everything else falls into place, but you got luck. But again, Lee has always needed the luck in this, right? I mean, he's got the outnumbered forces. He's needed help from the Federals. Did the Federals give him some help on the first day of Gettysburg? Yeah, they end up fighting the battle. George Meade takes over from Hooker, right? Meade is very much a general in the McClellan mode. An engineer, West Point graduate. He wants to keep his army in a good, concentrated position, which is the logic behind the Pipe Creek plan that he develops on the 1st of July. But of course, John Reynolds and John Buford get the army engaged in the fight at Gettysburg, and Pipe Creek plan sort of gets tossed out. Alan Gelzo, you read his book, he'll tell you Meade wanted to retreat the whole time. That's Alan. Alan hates George Meade. I think it's personal. But I mean, that Meade wants to conduct this campaign. His Pipe Creek plan is informed by the same kind of analysis of where the asymmetric advantages are for the Federals versus for the Confederates. Lee's approach to Gettysburg is shaped by the same sort of thinking of where are my asymmetric advantages over the Federals. And so, but again, the Pipe Creek plan doesn't get implemented. The Battle of Gettysburg starts on the 1st of July, and anybody who understood the dynamics of the campaign in the East, what happens is eminently predictable. It's a fluid situation. Which side can respond faster and quicker? And the 1st of July is, you got to give the day to the Confederates, right? Then we get the second day of battle, right? What's the situation at the second day of battle? It is a day of transition. Both sides are still concentrating their forces. Okay, they're still concentrating their forces. Meade is trying to get his army well in hand, well positioned. Lee is trying to find a way to hit him before Meade can carry that out. Okay. Now there's all kinds of delays in the day, but the basic idea is try to hit him on two flanks, and maybe the Federals will make a mistake and create an opportunity to achieve a decisive success on the 2nd of July. Well, there's debate about it, but I think it's pretty clear Dan Sickles makes a mistake, creates an opportunity for success on the southern side of the battlefield. But Lee achieves some tactical success, but it's not enough because Meade has enough forces coming up to contain any successes that Lee is going to achieve. And then comes the third day of battle, and George Meade's not going to command. We found out he was in command. Lee said, this is not a good thing. Meade's not the kind of guy who's going to make a mistake on my front. 3rd of July, Meade's got his army in position. His guns are in position. It's not a campaign of maneuver. Lee tries to find ways to not do what he ultimately does. It turns out he ends up doing the frontal assault on Meade's position. And again, in retrospect, we know this is going to be a failure. But if you know the history of the war in the East, the Yankees can be counted on in almost every engagement to make a mistake somewhere. They're not solid blue blocks on a map. These are human beings who've been quite generous in the past. And they're not going to be, but the surest way to get them to make mistakes is to engage them. Get them wrapped up in the fog and the friction of war so they make decisions on incomplete information. Of course, George Meade doesn't do that. The Union Army doesn't do it on the third day. It's a kind of battle. It's an Army Potomac kind of battle. And the Union wins a decisive victory on the third day of the battle. Lee eventually retreats back into the road to victory. From getting a long story after Gettysburg, wars still got a little bit to go. What basically ultimately happens under Ulysses S. Grant is, after the bloodiness of the Overland Campaign, he gets Lee into a campaign of trenches, of artillery, of siege work around Richmond and Petersburg. And when that campaign is over, on April the 2nd, 1865, the Confederacy has only a week of life left in it. Lee's army only has a week of life in it. And of course, with Lee's army, rests the hopes of the Southern people that this government can defend them, can protect them, can achieve victories. Thank you very much. few questions? Yes. Bruce.
Pointed out that he had experience before the war as staff officer, engineer, and field commander. How does that compare to the other high-level generals during the Civil War? Did they have that similar breadth of pre-war experience?
Engineering, yes, you have a number of people with engineering experience. In terms of actual field command, the only person who's had any kind of significant field command was Winfield Scott. He commanded the 14,000 men in the, actually, the outside, antebellum army, the largest assembly of troops that takes place before the Civil War takes place at militia musters. Nobody in the antebellum army has the experience that Ben Butler did as a militia commander in Massachusetts, conducting a review and maneuver with 6,000 troops. Okay, they just don't get that kind of experience. Now, what they do get, which is very valuable in the antebellum army, is because the army has conducted an extensive campaigns geographically on the frontier, where logistics plays a big role. The quartermaster's department is a very, very well, I mean, the legacy that the quartermaster's department has, I mean, projecting power over distances, that's what it's basically taking the problem to a larger scale. But the antebellum army does have experience with that kind of logistical support for extended operations, and that's very valuable for the Civil War. In terms of preparation for command, there was an assumption that being a staff officer was your best preparation because you were at the right hand of a commander as he was making decisions about big operational decisions. But in terms of actual field command, it just wasn't something these guys were trained to do. If they read Jomini or if they read a Napoleonic book, wonderful. This was an interesting story. But this army is an army of lieutenants. It conducts constabulary operations in the frontier. It builds roads. It establishes forts. It projects civilization. It pacifies the tribes. What army does that today? Well, no. Okay. But what it's not doing, it's not preparing for. There's often criticism of the United States Army for not being prepared to fight the Civil War. Okay. The United States Army today is not prepared to fight a Civil War. I hope not, right? They're not making up plans for this, right? The antebellum army is a constabulary, power projection, nation-building army. They're not prepared to fight a war like this. So if they read a book, they read Jomini, they read Napoleon book, this is an interesting story, but I'm never going to do something like this. Of course, they do start doing something like this, and they've got to kind of learn as they're going along. But there is none of that preparation for high command. West Point teaches lieutenants and engineers. And that's what it does. Then you have the frontier. Dick Ewell famously said, I went out on the frontier, I learned everything there was to command a company of dragoons, and I forgot everything else. Yes, sir.
Yes, my question is this. You mentioned at the beginning, it sounds bad, but just to stay put, and wait for the Union troops to come. Wasn't that kind of what the Germans also did
The Confederacy and the Germans.
Can you repeat the question?
His question was, the question was the defensive strategy, wait for the enemy to come in and attack rather than take the initiative. That's kind of what the Germans did at Normandy. The German idea at Normandy, there was a division of opinion. There was the idea to defend on the beaches, or do we wait for the enemy? Because if try to defend the beaches means we got to defend everywhere, which means we defend nowhere. Rommel's idea was in line with World War I, with the doctrine developed in World War I. You hold light defenses at the front, but you hold back counterattack forces, and then you concentrate your forces for the strike. In some ways, that's Lee's idea. We want to concentrate our forces for offensive operations, counteroffensive operations. Once we figure out where the Federals are going to come, we'll have our forces concentrated and strike them where they come, and then get them in campaigns. So there is some rough analogy to that. Robert E. Lee's lack of tanks was a big difference, but that's probably good. World War I tanks were not very effective. But does that answer your question? Okay. I saw the survey. Gentleman here.
How large was Lee's class at West Point? Those were small classes.
The classes are very small. West Point, the entire four-year cadre at the time, we've never really been larger than 200. So his class is probably about 50 graduate. And again, there was this Pickett. He comes up, pick at this idiot who finished last in his class at West Point, right? All these dummies that finished last in class at West Point. Keep in mind, West Point classes lose half of their students in the course of the 4 years. Okay? And just to get appointed to West Point, you got to get congressional support. You got to demonstrate you can actually do something academically. Then you've got to go through a series of very rigorous entrance examinations to get in. Just to get into West Point is a heck of an accomplishment for anybody in antebellum America. And then to live through the conditions at West Point, where, I mean, it's, you get a mattress on the ground, the food sucks, and you're harassed by the seniors, and you've got to recite everything, okay? And there's the engineering, I looked at some of the curriculum, engineering, mathematical stuff they got to do, eons beyond me. And you got to imagine these guys, they don't know about modern hydration and nutrition and stuff like that. It was a really rigorous experience. So for anybody to get through, first in the class is a heck of an accomplishment. Even to finish 46 in the class of 46 is a heck of an accomplishment at West Point. So again, don't put too much stock on the guy finished lower in his class at West Point. I couldn't finish at West Point. So who am I to judge? Of course, my math still sucks, which is why I didn't hate math. I mean, I took algebra like 3 years in a row. I loved it so much. Sorry, your question.
All right, so if you leave and you know what the Confederates have got and they don't have and all this sort of stuff, what do you do?
That is an excellent question. And that is ultimately the question for me. What do I do? I have a menu of bad choices and god-awful guaranteed to fail choices. Working through the third day at Gettysburg, okay? When the Marines do their sort of thinking about campaigns and campaign plans, they got an acronym called DRAW. Your options at the beginning of any day of battle. What are our options there? One is D, defend. Third day at Gettysburg. Can Lee go on the defensive? He could, okay? But it's a question of cost and benefits. He goes on the defensive. Remember, Lee's army is maneuvering in the north, and they're maneuvering on a very limited supply line, okay? If he stays in one place, when the great danger for Napoleon comes, Napoleon maneuvers great when his army's marching, because when his army's marching, they steal the food from the local area, and they move on to the next place, steal the food there. But the second they stop, they're in the same area for a long time, and it's hard to be run out of stuff to steal, okay? And so go on the defensive, and because that relies on Meade is going to do something stupid to make an attack. And one thing Meade, he may not be the most bold and exciting guy in the world, but he's probably not going to make a stupid decision to attack. Okay. The R is retreat. Okay, retreat from Gettysburg on after. But if you're Lee, you're going north. Not just to achieve a battle, but to have a moral effect on the North. You can't destroy the ability of the North to make war. They just got too much stuff. What you can do, the only way you can win, is you break the North's will not to use that stuff anymore. Okay? Well, how do I break their will to use it? Well, the answer is you affect the political process in the North. And in 1863, winning victories could be very, very beneficial for the Confederacy, particularly at the time, because you've got two critical gubernatorial elections in 1863, in Ohio and in Pennsylvania, okay? If the Republicans lose Ohio and Pennsylvania, all know about Civil War armies, they're not raised by the federal government, they are raised by the states, okay? Governor Curtin has been an incredibly enthusiastic Republican supporter of the Lincoln administration in raising troops. I mean, they raised, you start bending the word, you're talking over 200 Pennsylvania regiments raised. I mean, no Pennsylvania regiments, no Army of the Potomac, okay? So, the keystone of the Army of the Potomac, right? All right. But again, the basic idea is if I can achieve victories, if I can make the war so frustrating for the North that they say, you know what, cost benefit of Union, cost to keep it, we'll give it up. That's the only chance Lee has to win the war, because he can't destroy their ability to make war. So to retreat from Gettysburg would be to concede he'd lost the battle, which is not going to have that moral effect. In any case, you won the battle on the first day. The second day was largely a draw, but still, you can say, I secured the Peach Orchard. You've all been to Gettysburg, right? Peach Orchard, we did the tour, the staff right there for the 150th program. You stand in the Peach Orchard. This is very, very important terrain on that battlefield. I've got it now, okay? I pushed the north back here. I pushed the north back there. And retreat doesn't give me any benefits, so forget retreat. A is attack, okay? And then the question comes, the other W is wait, but that's one on the passive defensive, and being on the passive defensive, the Confederates have proven to be a loser, okay? So the final thing is attack. The question becomes, how do we attack it? His initial idea is to do what he did the day before, which is to try to attack both ends of the Federal line, but Longstreet is slow to get started, and by the time Lee can really coordinate something, the Federals of the 12th Corps have already punched Richard Ewell's guy, given him a good slug, meaning there's going to be no coordinated attack on either side. In any case, you're thinking logically for the problem. They were strong on one flank, strong on another flank. They got to be weak somewhere. And I was talking last night. The analogy to Antietam, okay? Gettysburg is Antietam in reverse. Antietam is Gettysburg in reverse. At Antietam, the Confederates are on an interior line, the Federals on an exterior line. Okay? And McClellan's basic plan is to hit it one place and hope Lee will weaken himself someplace else on his line, which has that effect. Lee strips his right of a division, which enables Burnside to get across, and they've got a pretty good opportunity to attack the Confederate right flank. Lee's in the same situation as McClellan was at Antietam. He's on a long exterior line. Meade is on an interior line. The way you deal with the enemy is hit him in one place, hope he shifted reserves someplace, and created a weakness somewhere else in the battlefield. So the assumption's got to be, I hit him on the two flanks. If he stripped his forces from anywhere to the center, and yesterday we nearly had a success in the center because Meade was caught up in that problem of shifting forces back around. So from a logical standpoint, once you work through the problem as Lee is working through the problem, you realize that what else is it's the least bad option that he has in front of him. Okay? The problem with him is the Federals are careful and cautious because usually they've got a series of, there's a risky option and there's a safe option. Okay? The safe option is not as potentially beneficial as the risky option, but it's a safe option. Okay? And even if it doesn't work out, we'll kill a lot of the Confederates anyway. Okay? Lee's situation is, I've got the safe option, which means I'm guaranteed to lose. I got the risky option, which gives me the only chance I have of not losing, so I might as well roll the dice. I mean, we love these armies in history that take chances, that are risky. The reason that Napoleon, love studying Napoleon, takes chances, he's a risk taker. He's got to do that because he is outnumbered. He's fighting the rest of Europe. He's got to take chances. If he doesn't take chances, he gets crushed. And in the end, Napoleon gets crushed. Robert E. Lee's got to take chances. Why? Because he's fighting the huge North. If he doesn't take chances, he gets crushed. That's the lesson of Yorktown. You study the Germans in World War II. They take lots of chances. They maneuver because if they don't take chances, they're fighting all of Europe. They're going to get, and ultimately they get crushed. Okay. Again, it's an interesting dynamic in military history. What militaries we study. Okay. And the forms of strategy they pursue, and the forces that shape strategy. This is the kind of thing we want our officers thinking about in studying history. Okay, I know there's a million words for my hero growing up as a kid was Joe Theismann. Okay, so I'm not going to slow down once I'm going to roll. Okay? The story of Joe Theismann was one time Joe Theismann he was in his house and he burned out the motor on his refrigerator because whenever he opened up the light came on and he just started talking for a half hour. Next question. I know. Yes, sir. Right here.
Going back to Yorktown, that's okay. I'm not used to hearing George McClellan praised as much as you were. Almost sounds like you were saying if McClellan had set the strategy and moved forward, the result would be different. So, would you finish your thought of what happened? What made the switch in Yorktown?
But McClellan understood the dynamics of the theater. He understood where he was strong and the Confederates were weak. The problem he has the big problem he has is, now let's come back to McClellan. He wants to ask about McClellan. The big problem is his relationship with his commander-in-chief. the changing war aims. He is, as just mentioned, the generals we study, the generals we say are awesome, are the generals who take lots of risks, okay? Who take chances, who fight and outnumbered and win, right? The bold commander. McClellan, for all his imaging and presenting himself as the bold commander, is not really a bold commander. But he doesn't need to be a bold commander, okay? We studied the question I asked my officers at PGSC. We're doing two lessons focused on Napoleon, okay? We're not doing any lessons based on Wellington. Wellington won in the end, okay? Well, that's not right. You know, Napoleon was outnumbered. You got to understand, you know, Wellington had everything on his side, you know. We studied the Germans and we studied their blitzkrieg. But we don't study Zhukov, the Russian commander. Oh, well, you know, he just had more people. You know, quantity has a quality all its own, as the Russians say, okay? And McClellan is safe, methodical. My suspicion is if Robert Lee and McClellan had changed place, McClellan may not have been as bold as Lee, because I just don't think McClellan's makeup was that way. But I think Lee would have been a very methodical and careful commander as well.
So was it Johnston's wounding?
Johnston's wounding was
Lee to come. He changed Yorktown to Pennsylvania.
Yeah, the answer is, you know, one of the questions, you know, what happened to Johnston stayed in command? I think Richard McMurray has speculated that if Johnston stayed in command in Atlanta, they would have fought the battle somewhere around Savannah because Johnston would have kept on retreating. Okay, but it's just, again, there's so many factors of contingency that play into this. McClellan is waiting for the forces to come down. Under orders, you will conduct your operations in line with our desire that McDowell's corps, which we held back from you to protect the valley, will come from the north. McClellan says, "I will do that. I will obey those. I will follow those rules." The problem is, until McDowell's guys arrive, McClellan's got to reach out with his right hand for when McDowell comes down, which means he has to use this railroad. And he's reaching out, and there's no one to grab. The Confederates can maneuver around him and go hit the railroad. And that's what happens in the 7 days battles. And once the 7 days battle setback takes place, McClellan is still championing the strategy of the North has changed. Lincoln administration in July fundamentally makes a change from the conciliation policy of a harder war against the South. And McClellan clearly makes clear that he is not comfortable with that. That's not something he wants to do. The appointment of Pope is supposed to change the war in the East by bringing a new commander who brings the right kind of spirit. Pope fails. McClellan comes back, says, "I'm back, it's great, I can win." But then the Emancipation Proclamation comes in, and the antagonism between Army Potomac headquarters and Washington just becomes too big to breach. Too big to bridge, and someone's got to go. And in our system, properly, the general's got to go when he can't work with the president anymore. So I mean, it's spelled out a lot more in detail in a book somewhere. But again, there's a lot of dynamics going into the McClellan-Lincoln relationship, which is why it inspires so much interest. In the subject. It's just the problem that, and of course, afterwards, the Armed Potomac generals are going to tend to be convinced the Peninsula Campaign was sound, but it was undermined by Washington. Washington is going to believe that the Peninsula Campaign was fundamentally unsound because it created the opportunity for the Shenandoah Valley Campaign. And Armed Potomac commanders are going to believe that Washington is too concerned about the defense of the capital and is tying the hands of the commanders. And this is a big conflict, and they believe that Republican politicians meddle too much in the war. When war should be a matter for professional officers, you know, the politicians create the war, and the generals go solve it, and then the politicians come in when the war is over. And that simply isn't, you know, it's nice as it would be to believe in that kind of clean separation between war and politics. It just is not realistic. And generals who try to separate war from politics generally end up losing strategic coherence. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So why wasn't McClellan able to just stay where he was? I mean, you know, what was going to push him off the peninsula?
The basic problem was Lincoln was concerned. He believed the problem out in the Shenandoah Valley was the three forces were not coordinated. Bring them together under John Pope. Lincoln never bought the Peninsula concept. He never bought it. He always believed that the Army of the Potomac should stay north of Richmond, operate along the railroads, because he just was not comfortable with the Army of the Potomac being away from Washington. Lincoln had read his plagiarized Jomini, aka Henry Halleck's Elements of Art and Science, and it said, you do not divide your army. Concentrate your army in one place. If the army goes to the peninsula, you got to leave some people behind. That violates the principle of concentration of your forces. You're going to choose to concentrate in one place. Lincoln would prefer that the concentration be done where Washington is safer. Along the Orange and Alexandria Railroad line of communications, which has many problems. One which discussed about railroads. The other, the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, goes southwest toward Charlottesville and not toward Richmond. And there's a fundamental problem with Orange and Alexandria, that strategic exhaustion problem you get. You reach the point where the Army of the Potomac has left so many guys behind that it doesn't have enough at the tip of the spear. You reach that point between the Rapidan and Rappahannock Rivers crossing. And that's why the Army constantly, when it's using that line of operations, gets stuck in that area. And that's where Grant is when he started the campaign in 64. That's where John Pope does his operations in 62. It's just, there's a problematic logistics with that. Then it's a big story that I've gone into in many details. There are these logistical issues there. And Lincoln his sense was always, again, at the beginning of the war, McClellan's sort of policy, you follow my ideas, I'll have the war with over quickly. And the campaign in the West won't matter so much, because once I capture Richmond, the Confederacy will collapse. Once McClellan has to step back to the peninsula, Lincoln listens to Halleck. Halleck's idea, Halleck, a protege of Winfield Scott, says, no, the war is going to last a long time. So we need to focus on logistical objectives out west, above all the Mississippi River. And so the emphasis of Northern strategy shifts from holding in the West, supporting in the West, decisive action in the East, to really holding in the East to decisive action out West. And that's going to be a fundamental change in the strategy of the war.
Thank you.
Yes?
I would preface this by saying it might be an accurate question, since you mentioned doing the staff audit. Can you tell me any historians who favor super action?
Dan Sickles? Historicus. You never heard of Historicus? The guy who wrote the editorial? His name was Historicus. Glenn Robertson wrote an essay in the Gary Gallagher collection, the three-volume collection of essays. Glenn Robertson makes a pretty good case for No. We had a discussion. We had a discussion at Peach Orchard. We showed how we do these staff rides. One of the ways we do characters. We had two pistols in the staff ride.
Wrong track.
One played Sickles, one played Meade. And one presented the Sickles case, the other presented the Meade case. The Sickles case was not as boring as the Meade case. Just different. Not to spoil anything. But the Sickles case can be made by standing on two pieces of ground. And that is, the first piece of ground you go to is Hazel Grove at Chancellorsville. Okay? And you look from Hazel Grove toward the Chancellorsville Crossroads. Okay? Keep that in your memory. Then go to the Peach Orchard. And look from the Peach Orchard towards Sickles' original position. It's not an exact match, but it is close enough that if you are Dan Sickles and you are remembering when a commander in Joe Hooker who you like told you to do this, as opposed to George Meade, who you hate, tells you to do something you don't trust. And again, this is a classic question that comes up in teaching Army officers. The question of how much initiative should a subordinate be able to exercise?
Did you go on
Okay? And it is one of the great questions because there is no formulaic answer
First
to
one I
it.
missed a long time.
Some situations, you delegate authority to the lower level guy, and it works out. Some it doesn't. The thing you want with officers is to try to get them away from the temptation to believe that every problem has a set mathematical answer to it, because war is much too complicated. I think that's what makes me sometimes because I have the ability to complicate the simple And that's part of what
was that?
makes the story fun. But again, it was the Gallagher essay and it's a,
Thank you.
as long as you know, you're thinking from, put yourself in Sickles',
You gotta stop talking.
it makes sense. These guys, when they make wrong decisions, there's rarely a situation where they make, once you understand the thinking, what they're doing, it's very hard not to be sympathetic to these guys. And the conditions of fog, friction, uncertain information, the physical conditions they're campaigning, it's hard not to be sympathetic to these guys. And I always consider a staff ride successful if the officers come away with greater sympathy and empathy for the losing commander than if they do for the winning commander. Because once you work through it like this, man, that winning commander got lucky as hell. And the often question, why don't they pursue after these battlefield victories? You got to figure for your commander, I just got lucky as hell. You're conscious, and the reports that everything went according to plan, but you are so cognizant of just how lucky you got in this in what happened, that the idea of pursuit just has got to seem like, I'm not going to push my luck too much of this thing. I mean, it's an understandable human condition in problem warfare, right? Again, it's not blocks on a map the way you have to depict it on the maps. Human beings making human decisions and drawing on the resources they have in very, very difficult. Yes, sir, back there.
Two questions.
Yes.
To address what you just talked about. Was part of it because of the nature of who the combatants were, and that they were people who knew each other, they were countrymen, and it wasn't like, let's just keep going and keep slaughtering them like you might with a foreign country, that people felt, okay, I won the fight today, go home, I'll go home, we'll come back tomorrow. Was there a little bit of that mentality?
The degree to which the brother versus brother sentiment is a matter of the haze of remembering the war and how much they really hated each other at the time. There's a lot of debate and scholarship over that. The degree to which Confederates really developed the hatred of the Yankees. They're not just brothers we happen to have a war with. We really do hate the Yankees for what they're doing. And northern soldiers taking the same attitude. Brother versus brother thing. We're fighting these people. They are resisting us, they're killing our friends. They've got these bushwhackers all over the place who don't follow the rules of war. Whatever comedy there may exist between combatants is usually a matter of memories fading after the war, I think. Nobody's going to be inviting. The only person combatants end up hating more than one of the dangers is, one of the things combatants end up having sometimes greater problem to do with the enemy is there's sometimes a danger that they have problems with their own people back home. You see this in soldiers' letters. I hate the rebels, but those copperheads are the worst. And this is an issue that comes up in contemporary. We talk about officers and their contemporary civil-military relationship. The danger, the question of having an all-volunteer army. What's its relationship with the civil society that it serves? I mean, is it a healthy one, or are they starting to develop there's the danger of what's sometimes called centurion mentality. And this is one of the contexts I put McClellan's infamous letter to Lincoln. You have done your best to destroy this army, letter. Horrible, unforgivable. But in the context of McClellan, why do the Army Potomac soldiers love him so much? You want a commander who will write that kind of letter to the politicians back home. You want someone who's willing to, the problem, of course, is it gets edited out of the transcript before Lincoln sees it. But McClellan in that letter is throwing down his stars and saying, fire me because I'm telling truth to power. Okay? And I put in that context and makes what McClellan's doing not defensible, but you can understand the mentality behind it. You have done your best to destroy this army, the army that I have built, that I have created, and to the people, the soldiers of the Army of the Potomac, I am your protector from the Washington politicians. I mean, that's a very powerful message for armies. And the concern is, as we develop an army that is less citizen, soldier-oriented, more professional, the danger of those kind of attitudes developing. The way the Army after after Algeria, during the Algerian conflicts, and the Vietnamese conflicts. I mean, this is another thing we talk about with our officers, assessing the degree to which the relationship between the civil and the military community.
Okay, last question.
Yes, sir.
How much do you think the day 3 charge up the center was influenced by Lee's confidence in himself? In other words, did he read too many press clippings?
He was unquestionably confident in his army. He said beforehand, the men are great. You know, they'll go anywhere, do anything I ask them to, if they're properly led. And this was in the context of, you know, Jackson is talking about reorganizing the army. How can I find the guys to lead this army?
But he refused Longstreet's advice.
Longstreet's advice is bad advice. That's why. The assumption you're making in Longstreet's, to do Longstreet's march, is the assumption that George Gordon Meade is too stupid to recognize the potential danger of a Confederate force separating from Washington. This goes into Sickles. One of the reasons Sickles makes his move is he's nervous because the cavalry, Buford's cavalry, is protecting his left flank, is sent away. It is sent down to Frederick. If Longstreet is going to make a move, if they're going to do Longstreet's march, first of all, you got to disengage all the way around. There's no way the Union doesn't pick it up somehow, somewhere. Okay, if they're in Virginia, they might not pick it up. You know, in Chancellorsville, where do we need to go? Hey, this guy lives nearby. He'll show us how to get there. Okay? No one's doing that in Pennsylvania. Okay, but you know, Buford's cavalry, the cavalry goes down to Frederick, and they are there watching and probing. And in fact, on the 3rd of July, they pose a danger to Lee's line of escape because on the 3rd of July, some Union cavalry makes a stab for Fairfield Gap, which is one of only 2 passes in South Mountain that Robert E. Lee has behind him to get back to his getaway route. And you know, there's some alert Confederates just show up on and prevent it from happening. But you know, if the Federals are alert to the situation down here, if it's up, Longstreet can look at a map and say, perhaps we should do this. The Federal can say the same thing. We can look what's the most dangerous thing they can do to us. And so that the Longstreet idea was not necessarily a great one. In terms of Lee having confidence in his, it was just a basic, I've tried this, I've tried this, I've tried this. Other options aren't good. So this is the least bad I can do. And Jackson's march, Chancellorsville's bad idea. It was based on the assumption that the Federals would be in the exact same place 10 hours later, that when the march ended, that they would be when the march began. And the only reason the Federals aren't in that situation is because an order from Hooker to John Reynolds to get to the battle was carried. Had it gotten there on time, had the orders been checked, Reynolds would have been there to help out the aptly named Howard. Okay? So, I mean, it's just how much these soldiers are aware. It is those kind of little slips here or there that happen in war. It's a human activity, you know? And their consciousness of this is going to shape a lot of the way they're approaching the problems. It's a big fault.
So you think it was Lee's only option then?
I think it was Lee's least bad option. Okay? And it was the only one that he could really feasibly carry off that day.
Thank you very much, Ethan.